first episode of the Real Football Show. I'm Rob Killender, I'm the host. Today we're going to be talking about why does the U.S., and this is specifically more the men's side, struggle to identify talent, how that compares to Europe and South America, and how they do things, and we're going to go a little bit into that. We have a special guest today, Anthony Jackson, who's going to come in and help share some of his thoughts. Just a little bit on my background. My son's been playing travel soccer now for well over 10 years. Been on the board of 2 clubs, helped start a club in South Carolina before we moved to Texas about 4.5 years ago. And just try to do this as independently of anything that I've seen and just kind of things that I've talked about with different coaches over the years and agents and things like that. So I have Anthony Jackson. And our special guest today, Anthony Jackson, has helped start a club here in Texas. He's a bit of an expert in kind of how things work here, but he's also been a soccer fan his whole life and a player. So he's also familiar with how things are done in other countries. So we're just going to kind of talk through that and how that differs and how we think maybe there's some things that the U.S. can do to improve what we're doing now.
All right, so sit in, comfortable, and then you won't have to worry about it. So you can welcome some down.
Well, welcome Anthony Jackson to the Real Football Show and first episode here. And for the people that don't know, I'm going to give a quick background on how things are done in Europe and South America. Specifically those 2 areas because a men's World Cup has never been won by anywhere outside of those 2 areas. Africa, US, North America, the Asian countries never have won a men's World Cup. Both of those areas have very similar ways that things are done. So to go into that, and Anthony, just pop in anytime when you're thinking about it, is when you're in Germany, England, Brazil, Argentina, and you're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, there's every little city has a club program.
Right.
And there's a very specific, as you go on, and if you, we'll get into Messi's a once in a lifetime
right.
type of thing, Ronaldo, same type of thing, but as you progress and you start showing abilities, there's going to be a very, if you're in this little country in Germany, and it's not going to matter, they have a very specific, they're going to say, okay, he's gotten to a point that our system isn't going to work, and there's no issue, there's no thing, they're going to want to push them up to the next
There's
spot.
a very clear pathway, right? There's a very clear pathway of grassroots, playing in your local area, in your community, what's easiest for every kid to access football, all the way to this child is at this next level. Now we're going to progress them to a more regional level. This child is at this next level. Now we're going to progress them. I think one of the reasons that is too, though, is because there's a clear presence of non-league football, semi-professional football, local clubs. That is part of the culture, especially in those other countries, where you don't just find every player becoming a professional player. There's other avenues outside of that. So, you talked about here in the United States, we basically have the idea of becoming a pro or going to college to play soccer. Those are the 2 pathways.
Right.
Other than that, it's just we consider it all just recreational soccer.
Right.
There's a huge differentiating trend if you were born in Germany. There's a huge differentiation in that pathway of starting in your local area as a recreational soccer pro, like everyone should, playing at the playground, playing with the lowest bar of entry. They should all be able to access soccer. There's that, all the way to these kind of clear funnels of, are you going to play for the local boys in town, the non-league club in town, the semi-pro in town, the pro outfit in the academy. There's all those avenues.
Well, and then the other thing again, this is, some people will know this, but if you go to any country in Europe, there's multiple levels of pro soccer. In the U.S., there's essentially 2. You have MLS, and then you have the USL League, and that's really it. And if you're in England, there's 6 levels. You have the Premier League, which is what everyone's talking about. A lot of people will know about the Championship, but what a lot of people don't know is there's 4 levels underneath that.
And included in that is what they call the non-league, like Exeter Championships, right, and things where guys work a job during the day and are part of a club. And there are tons of young men, not quite as many women. We'll talk about that a little more. But there are tons that are part of that as well. So there's a lot of ways to to take this game that you've learned as a child and continue playing it long into your 30s and even 40s in those areas, you know. If
well, and my best example for this, and I know Anthony, he knows this, is Jamie Vardy. You know, I don't get the years exactly right, but 10, 12 years ago, he was playing in what in England they basically call a bar league. It's professional. It's not really a league. He's doing something else, and he did well enough that he skyrocketed all the way from there up into into the championship. Leicester City is who he ended up with. Helped them move up into the Premier League and then win the Premier League as a club that never at that level never wins the Premier League.
Yep. And Jamie Vardy is a bit of like a Messi or Ronaldo case in that it's the highest point of the case. But there are a ton of players who you never hear about until their club makes promotion or until they're in the championship and they get picked up by a club that makes promotion and then they become a mainstay at that club. And they're 25, 26, 27, 28. Not every player is found at 16, 17, 18 years old. There are a lot of them that, you know, especially in the Bundesliga, in Germany, even in La Liga, that are journeymen, that grind their way into roles in clubs and go from Barca's, you know, we'll just use Barca's B team as an example, but Barca's B team into Villarreal or into another club, and they become a mainstay there. And you know, there's a lot of that going on. So there's not just the most exciting prospect.
Right, and then and kind of back up to where we're talking about with US is that in Germany and everything else, there isn't this like barrier. And we'll get into in other episodes. We'll get into with the US and how it compares. But there's no barrier for the local club to send that player up. Where here there definitely is barriers for that. And again, I don't really get into that part today, but it's like if you're exceeding at your local club, they want you to move up. They're encouraged. There's financial reasons that they want you to move up.
There's clear financial guidelines. That's a huge part.
And they want that player to move on to the next club because again, financially they're going to benefit.
Yep.
And that's a lot of how they're able to play for free is because of that financial benefit.
Yep.
Is so that the club, when they sell that player on, they get money which they then helps them reinvest back in their own club.
I mean, whether you like it or not, in South America you have agents who own portions of rights, naming rights and things like that. They help protect the player from becoming a club's poster boy for no other reason than the club's benefit, financials benefit. And especially for, it's ludicrous when you think about here in America, especially what we're dealing with here in Central Texas, where there are giant organizations that are non-profit organizations who are holding on to players to prop up their own, basically to make more money for themselves versus to create professional avenues for those players, right? And to do what's best for their development. And that a lot of it comes back to the disconnect between your local clubs here. They're run autonomously without a connection to the MLS teams, without a connection to the USL teams. And that's happening, more and more and more that's happening. I think that was always going to be a natural part of, if you look at the way that the Dutch became a mainstay on the national stage, it was redefining their system in total football countrywide, right? And teaching it at almost every academy. But then academies really became, Ajax, PSV, those academies really became sales clubs, development clubs for a large stretch of time. Because they couldn't compete with a Bayern Munich financially or a Real Madrid financially, or it was brilliant to see them have some success in the Champions League and things like that did push their brand out, created, but they didn't have the kind of stadium sizes they needed. They didn't have the kind of revenue generation that they needed. So they turned to player development for revenue generation, and they turned to selling on players, developing players for pennies on the dollar in this national team system, this nationalized system, and really then being able to sell those players to the Bayern Munichs, to the Man Uniteds, to the Barcelona's, and making a ton of money, generating a ton of revenue. At one point, I think there was the scale may have flipped for Ajax, but they were making more off player sales than they were off revenue, which is amazing because that was allowing them to really inject money into development, and they did. They injected that money into longevity and development and began to compete. Arsenal's a good example of a club that did that in England.
Man U
back in the day, right? And so I think a lot of MLS teams, especially FC Dallas, Colorado, Utah, some Kansas City are really trying to model that behavior and say, can we capture the best 16, 17, 18-year-old players in America? And whether they play for our first team for long or not, can we help to develop, take the step to sell them on to a European club, receive that $4.5, $5.5, $20 million price tag?
Yeah.
And, $20 million is probably the sum total of I don't think a decade of FC Dallas's development academies cost $20 million. So one player gives them another 2 decades of development, like when you look at the raw
Well, and a
numbers.
quick aside there, because we'll come back to some of the things I think we should do for the U.S. soccer, but that's inside of that, since we're in Texas, and he brought up FC Dallas, the problem with that is FC Dallas is only exposed to really the kids in Dallas.
In the North Texas area.
And
yeah,
we have
absolutely.
Houston, we have Austin, we have San
South
Antonio, we have
Texas.
El Paso, we have all these different areas. There isn't a clear way for the kids outside of Dallas to move up,
Yeah.
which in any of these other countries, South America or Europe, there absolutely would be. It would
Yep.
be clear, it would be easy, it would be, and the clubs would benefit from selling them on, which, and to transition a little bit to something that works with the U.S. is Klinsmann, when he was the German coach, and to me he doesn't get enough credit for the German World Cup because he's the one who changed their system.
Yeah,
In Germany, their system was broken. They realized that they brought Klinsmann in. The difference in Germany, when Klinsmann took over as national coach, when he said something, every club listened.
yep,
He said, this isn't working, we need to fix it. He came up with the system and it was incorporated. When he came to the U.S., he attempted to do the same thing here, either not knowing or maybe hoping or praying or however you want to look at it, that it would work the same here.
yeah,
But it's not, because we are so disjointed across states, across clubs, across everything else. Without naming names, one of the things that always frustrated me with the DA system is back to the Klinsmann time, they had a very clear idea that they wanted to teach something similar to total football. Maybe
Yeah.
not exactly, but that was the idea.
yeah,
Possession style, everything else.
yep,
And that was coming from Klinsmann. This is what I want to come down, and
Right.
I don't think it's gone away. It just maybe transitioned a little bit.
yeah,
And you had DA programs which are supposed to be tied into U.S. soccer, not doing that. And I'm like, well, if this is what U.S. soccer wants, and I don't necessarily care from the standpoint of the style they want to play, it's up to them. But if there's a style you want to play, and if you're tied into that system, then you should hold those clubs accountable.
yep,
If you want to teach total football and you're not, and your clubs inside of your DA program aren't,
yeah.
and that's
Yeah, and you have to
Definitely.
examine what reasons why they aren't
Yeah.
in the first place. And I just for viewer or listeners who are not used to that word total football, I would argue, and I don't think there would be really any argument against it, that every modern club in Europe, in South America, in the curriculum they're currently teaching finds its roots in the Dutch system of total football that Johan Cruyff, took from that Dutch national team to Barcelona, that became the Tiki Taka movement. Like, there's tons of, it's basically the idea that 10 outfield players all play as midfielders instead of this static delineation between forward line, midfield, and defensive line that we used to see. Part of that, the offside rule changed, and that helped to players to understand strategically, or coaches, that they could compress the field. But you used to see, like when you go back and look at Liverpool domination days, you would see the back line 30 yards behind midfield, the midfield hanging around the midfield stripe, the forwards 30 yards ahead, and there were these kind of pockets or areas of the field that everyone occupied. That's totally changed in the modern game, and now there is some sort of brand of total football development at the core of almost every, of course there's so many intricate, developments of it, from Klopp system to Guardiola systems so there's so much there, but they find their roots there. And in North America, it's astonishing still that you see development academies and major outlets, major organizations not having a fundamental idea or a core curriculum based out of total football.
well, and I completely agree, because I played growing up, and it's changed. I was a goalkeeper and a midfielder back in the day, and when I played, and it's been a while, my son would say it was back in the dinosaur times, which wasn't
Right.
quite true. You didn't play back to the goalkeeper.
Yeah.
I remember one of my midfielders playing it back to me. He scored on me because, for one, the field was terrible, but
Yeah.
two, the ball was never played to me.
Yeah, you
Just
have no
and when
idea
he, when he
where-
played back, I just wasn't expecting it.
Yeah.
So that's changed. Every club plays that. And again, what Anthony's getting to is with the total football, there's no harm in teaching it, and there's tons of benefits in teaching that so that people learn it. Again, I guess what comes to me is like, you look at the World Cup when the Netherlands played Spain.
Yeah.
Again, they both come from an idea of total football, but if you watch that match, and it wasn't unexpected, the Spain team was elite at the top of that total
Yep.
football. The Netherlands, which still came from the idea of that, played physical, because that's the only thing they could do.
Right.
At that level, that's fine, but they're still
They couldn't match the technicality.
they couldn't match the technicality of the Spain, so they
Yeah.
didn't try. They
Right.
tried to do something else. That's fine at that higher level.
Right.
But when you look at the basis, you can't teach physical play and then you're completely reliant. You can teach total football and then make changes
100%.
strategically.
And here's the thing that is really interesting, since we're looking at the South American system, the European system. One of the most interesting things I think is that most people don't view teaching a sport the same as like teaching a musical instrument, but they are. It's teaching a skill set. It's a craft ability. It's a bunch of skill sets that go into making up the game, right? I always tell my kiddos that soccer, there's three parts to soccer. There's the athletic mastery, there's the artistic mastery, the technical ball skill mastery, and then there's the chess mastery. There's the IQ of the game. And those three things are going on in that, and that's why soccer is one of the most difficult sports to play. And I've learned, my dad was a coach, grew up in East Texas. My dad coached high school level, basketball, baseball, football, golf, tennis. I've learned a number of sports. Have I mastered them? No, but I'm proficient as an athlete in a number of sports. And when I look at, my oldest son, who's now graduated, he's out of, he's in his mid-20s. When he began to learn music at 11, 12 years old, he had to sit down and learn technique, where to put his fingers on a piano, how to sit up straight, what to do with his feet, how to learn the scales, how to, trim across those, learn the motor skills that it took to play the instrument. Then he also had to learn, practice those scales, practice that repetition until that technique until he mastered that technique well enough for us to say he could play the piano. Do the same thing with the violin. Learn to read sheet music. Learn to listen to music and hear note changes, things like that. Learn tempo, rhythm, pace. There was all of these individual things he needed to learn to master the art of playing music. And it's the same with football or with soccer. And the tricky thing for us in North America is that I think, like when I was growing up playing baseball, I had to learn to hit the ball, I had to learn to throw the ball, I had to learn to field some ground balls, field some fly balls. There were 4 or 5 different major things I needed to learn and master, and then I could effectively go out and play the sport.
Yeah.
With soccer, there's a lot more involved. There's a lot more involved. And the biggest piece is the fluidness of the IQ. And the reason why it's, like when you were in American rules football, you basically play for 8, 9 seconds, you huddle for 30 or 40 and talk about the next play. You've memorized the plays, you've learned your individual routes, someone calls that play in. So there's a guidance, the overall guidance of the way the game, the way you attack on offense, the way you defend on defense is coach-led, it's coach-guided.
Yeah.
When you're on a soccer field for 90 minutes and you have one break in the middle, then most of the guidance of the game, the way you attack, the way you defend, the way you transition, those moments of transition, is all led by the player's IQ and their ability to understand and read the game. I would say that the game of soccer is much like a language, much more like a language than anything that I've ever experienced. And maybe music has the same thing, I'm not a musician, but definitely more like a language. Here's what baffles me is that in this country we teach the athletic mastery skills. We teach, that's number one, because we understand that. As we're playing a sport we don't understand. Basically, when I started playing soccer, my parents didn't understand that game. We understood all the other games that I was learning, but that one I loved for, reasons that I can identify now as an older man. Couldn't figure out then, but there wasn't a very good understanding of it. So athletic mastery, they did understand. So that we taught that. I was in the weight room, I ran 9 miles, 3 or 4 times a week. There were things that I was doing to be a better soccer player. Technical and ball mastery, that artistry of expressing yourself on the ball, that we taught, and we still teach that. We lag behind some other countries in that, and I think for one main reason, but we still teach that. We understand that. What we don't still understand at a broad level across this country, at a grassroots level, is the teaching of the language or the IQ of soccer. And the problem that we're addressing is that we're teaching those other two until 13 or 14 years old, and then saying, oh, now you're old enough to understand the concepts of the language. You're too old.
You're too old.
You're too old to learn a language. You learn a language when you're 2 or 3 years old.
When we lived in South Carolina, because there were 2 Marine bases, we had a bunch of people that float in and out of the area because you don't know, you're stationed at a Marine base for 3 years and then you move on. So you
Right.
see a lot of different things. And we ended up having a neighbor whose wife was from Paraguay, and the mom of his wife was living with them. And I still remember going over to a birthday party or some party they were having at the house, and she was watching, this was way before I had regained my interest in soccer. She was watching a soccer football match, and the passion this 70-year-old lady had
For the game. Yes.
I don't know who she was rooting for, but it was intense.
Yeah.
It was, and that's the thing. In South America, Europe, and even in a lot of other countries, you learn on the knee of your dad.
That's right.
And
You learn the language organically.
Early.
And organic.
2, 3, 4 years old.
Right.
Because it's easy, like Anthony's talking about, it's easy to learn the language at that point. That's when you should learn the language.
Right.
It becomes a
It's a
passion.
cultural thing. It's when you grow up in a bilingual home and your parents speak English and Spanish, you're much more likely to learn both languages from almost a cultural perspective. No one's teaching you both languages. You're learning both languages. And there's a interesting TED Talk with a guy who figured out how to learn languages in 5-6 months. I'm not sure if that's dead on accurate, but
Right.
the guy knows a ton about language. He talks about the mom character in the language learning. And that's the character who can identify your gibberish, like when you're learning, and understand your gibberish and then guide you along in your gibberish without any real risk to your own personal identity or your own confidence. That mom will say, oh, Lello, you want Lello? Here's Lello. Mom doesn't correct you to yellow or to, mom brings you along in the language as you begin to take the risk of speaking, as you begin to take the risk of expressing yourself.
Yeah.
The problem in our country is that if you wait until you're 13 or 14 years old to try to learn the language of soccer, and you see this factor a lot with kids who come from Mexico, from a culture that learns the language culturally, almost naturally.
Yeah.
They have the 70-year-old grandma sitting in their room, like watching soccer all day, explaining things, teaching it. The thing that you see with, you have a few of those kids, you have 40% of those kids, 30 or 40% of those kids who are understanding the language more naturally. And then you combine them with a bunch of kids you're trying to teach the language to. Well, those kids who don't understand the language, they feel stupid. They reject the risk of trying to learn the language because it affects their confidence overall. And so it affects their ability to go out and play the game as well. So you have this real cliff that we run kids into, where around the age of 13 they start dropping off that cliff. I think for young ladies, it's like 50% of them don't play soccer anymore. Now, there's a large group of young ladies who, once they go through puberty and they become young adults, they should decide what it is they really